A strange quiet is settling over the dating scene. Writing in The Atlantic, Faith Hill looks at a growing romance slump, where women are walking away from the search for a partner, rather than accepting an unequal deal. It feels like a strictly modern shift, but a look backward changes the picture. In Aeon, Rosa Campbell revisits the sexual revolution of the 1970s, tracking how early feminist researchers realized that throwing out the old rulebook for sex did not actually make women happier. Read side by side, a sharper question surfaces. What happens when society strips away the traditional rules around intimacy, but leaves the actual power balance between men and women completely untouched? Writing last week, Faith Hill begins 90 seconds into a 3-minute hug with a complete stranger. She uses this $100 singles event in a candlelit loft to point out a modern contradiction. Despite having phones full of dating apps, young adults are going on fewer dates and having less sex. Notice how Hill explains this romance slump, arguing that many women are choosing to opt out entirely rather than settle for unequal partnerships.
Updated at 5:13 p.m. ET on August 3, 2026. About 90 seconds into a 3-minute hug with a stranger, I began to think that dying alone might not be so bad after all. I'd come to a candlelit loft in Manhattan for a mindful singles event called The Feels, which was designed to be the opposite of the disembodied experience of dating apps. Participants, phones tucked away, paired up and attempted a series of somatic awareness exercises, including staring into each other's eyes, hugging, and holding a hand over each other's heart. We'd been warned that discomfort is part of the process. A facilitator had reminded us that as long as consent and respect are involved, a little uneasiness opens the door to vulnerability. Having paid $100 for a process advertised as better relating, informed by Carl Jung and the Buddha and the body's infinite wisdom, participants were motivated to agree. And many of us, more by circumstance than by choice, were already experts in exiting our comfort zone. We'd spent years meeting strangers, opening ourselves to judgment, scrounging for conversation topics, worrying about our outfits, gargling mouthwash in the office. But we still hadn't found what or whom we wanted. We came ready to get to work. The mere existence of The Feels, which hosts events in cities across the United States, suggests that we are living in a time of romantic plenty. In New York City, I could go to a dating event every night of the week. I could use a matchmaking service, or talk with a dating coach, or sign up for one of the many newsletters trying to bring back personal ads.
Even if I didn't live in a major city, I'd have dating apps to choose from. Not only Tinder and Hinge, but a zillion others. Platforms for farmers, gamers, single parents, cannabis enthusiasts, and members of the gluten-free community. I have 4 apps in my current rotation. As I write this, one of them has 317 message threads and 455 likes that I need to evaluate. And yet, despite the bounty of possibility, we are living through a great romance slump. Romance is a broad term, of course. Traditionally, it manifests in the thrill of sex, the devotion of long-term partnership, or the ritual of courtship, including the act of hope that is a first date. But all of those manifestations are becoming less common in the US, especially among young people. The proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds in marriages or cohabiting partnerships dropped steeply from 1980 to 2022, by almost 10 percentage points for college graduates and more than 20 percentage points for people without a degree, according to an analysis by the Financial Times data reporter John Byrne Murdoch. A shrinking share of young adults have a steady partner, and in 2019, 42% of single adults younger than 40 told Pew Research Center that they'd never been in a committed relationship. In a 2025 YouGov poll, 69% of single respondents said they rarely or never go on dates. And people are having less sex. From 2000 to 2018, the share of 25 to 34-year-olds who said they hadn't had sex in the previous year almost doubled. It's not that people have lost interest in love. A majority of single young adults say they want lifelong partnership. But for a variety of reasons, fewer of them are finding it.
Ali Hoffman, a former CEO of a digital media company who launched The Feels in 2022, has observed a collective "this sucks" among romance seekers. She has expanded her offerings accordingly.
At a Level 2 feels event, which costs up to $215, you can be paired with people at a similar stage in their awareness journey. A spot at a singles weekend retreat starts at $1,300, 3 matches based on a questionnaire and a phone call, plus 6 coaching sessions over 3 months, total $4,750. In a romance recession, some people give up and some double down. So here I was, doubling down, sweating in a strange man's arms. My neck hurt. I couldn't figure out how close to him I should stand. Too near and you lose breathing room. Too far and the whole enterprise falls apart. For years, I'd been in the same group chat with pretty much the same single friends. We'd labeled it the Lonely Hearts Club, and it became a sanctuary for dishing about weird dates, complaining about getting ghosted, sharing links to TikTokers dishing about weird dates and complaining about getting ghosted. I'd received variations of the same "I'm not feeling a spark" text so many times that I started replying with a single emoji, salute. But at the feels, I was trying to be open and optimistic. I'd stared into someone's eyes for 3 languid minutes, wondering if I was blinking a normal amount. I'd been moved, feeling another person's heartbeat beneath my palm, as anyone with a pulse would be. The hug was the last round, though, and then real life resumed. We mingled, but the intimacy had disappeared. One man told me that he had high emotional intelligence and could tell that I did too. Then he suggested that we travel together someday, handed me his business card, and walked away.
I gave a few people my phone number, including one man who sent me a picture of his face the very next morning, and another who texted me so much, even after a polite rebuff, that I had to block him. One date with another guy resulted, but I wasn't interested in a second. The perception of abundance had once again evaporated into nothing. I don't mean to suggest that people need romance to be fulfilled. In truth, I don't believe that partnership is inherently better than singlehood. As a society, we've been moving toward this point for decades, where marriage is not a prerequisite for social and financial survival, where we have other sources of purpose and community, where there are many different ways to live a good life. Yet now that we're here, the reality doesn't feel quite so triumphant. If the dream was more equal partnerships, born from love rather than necessity, freedom rather than convention, what many of us got was no partnership at all, and a feeling that it was eternally out of reach. Those getting ever closer to 40 especially tend to feel a particular sense of impending loss. Those are the years when the average unpartnered person struggles most with singlehood. Jeff McDonald, a University of Toronto psychologist, told me. It's like everybody find a lifeboat, he said. It's a period of acute open-endedness, when people are trying to figure out what to prioritize, how to plan for the future, which dreams are worth pursuing and which have to be sacrificed. For women who want to have biological children, it's also when time is running out. One 39-year-old I talked with, a woman who works in film, told me she felt like she was on a precipice. She was weighing having kids and knew the clock was ticking. She'd had a great time on a feels weekend getaway, and although she hadn't formed a lasting romantic connection, she'd made friends. They chat in a WhatsApp group about their dating highs and lows. Her life is full. Still, she said, the world is burning. I would really like to be able to go through that with someone. I wanted that for her, and for myself. Or at least I wanted to understand why we weren't finding what we wanted. So I did what I know how to do. I reported. I interviewed dozens of researchers and single people across the country, endured a series of curious but fruitless dating events, and bravely subjected myself to some actual dates. The romance slump, I found, is a product of broader trends: souring gender relations, a transformed economy, the unevenness of social progress, and technology that both connects and isolates us. Millions of individual heartaches are rewriting the love story we've told ourselves for centuries. Just to be clear, I'm not nostalgic for how things used to be. For much of human history, romance was incidental. Marriage was typically a practical arrangement, a way to unite families and consolidate resources. In the industrial age, young people began relocating to cities for work and enjoyed newfound independence and leisure time.
Courtship moved from the family parlor to the dance hall. But women still didn't have many pathways, other than marriage, to financial independence or to sex. The fact that my great-grandmother got pregnant before she was married at the beginning of the 20th century was such a source of family shame, never freely discussed, that my mother felt its dark shadow when she was growing up in the 1950s and 60s. That was the peak marriage era, when almost 90% of women in the U.S.
were married before they turned 25. Even as second-wave feminism boomed, banks could still require a woman to obtain permission from her husband or a male relative to get a home loan or apply for a credit card. In 1965, the Supreme Court held that the government couldn't restrict a married couple's access to birth control, but unmarried people were granted no such right. A few years later, my mother, who was living with her boyfriend at the time, wore a fake wedding ring, a plastic one from a gumball machine, to her doctor appointment to request the pill. Beginning in the 70s, though, wider access to contraception and abortion began to curb shotgun weddings, and more women entered college and the workforce. Stigmas around singlehood and queer relationships loosened. The nuclear family model, once such a source of gravity, lost some of its pull. The decline of marriage could also be called the rise of choice, especially for women, Philip N. Cohen, a University of Maryland sociologist, told me. The 1950s family could not even reproduce itself for one generation, he said. They couldn't even convince their children that this was the right way to arrange their lives, so it failed immediately. I came along in 1995, a lucky moment in many ways. Growing up in the 21st century, I daydreamed not about whom I'd marry, but about what fabulous career path I'd choose. In elementary school, I made business cards that said, "Psychologist. Got a problem? Call me," and distributed them on the playground. When my grandmother was widowed in her 50s, her friends, all couples, stopped calling her. It wasn't proper for them to socialize with a single woman. When my mother got divorced in her 50s, she wasn't abandoned by her friends, but she was always aware of her single status in a social snow globe of married people. I'm 31 now, and most of the people in my circle are single. Quite a few of them have never been in a relationship. I spent this past Valentine's Day on a beach in Mexico with two of my best friends. And yet, for many people, singlehood is at once eminently normal and entirely unwanted. Even an unhappily single person, Cohen said, is a sign of progress. At least they haven't been forced to partner with someone they don't want to be with. But that's like telling someone with a cavity to be grateful for modern dentistry. Completely correct and a little annoying. In interviews, people kept saying they knew they ought to make time for romance. But then when would they see their friends, or travel, or exercise, or get ahead at work? Dating has always entailed some hardship, but it used to be the norm to find love in everyday life. At the office, at church, at a party. People didn't need to choose what to step away from. Now many of the quirks of modern life have made meeting organically in person less likely. More people are tucked away at home, working remotely, streaming TV, and having food delivered to their door. Approaching strangers feels fraught when so many of us are used to flirting via text with people who have already liked us. So we depend on the apps, even as we resent them. Dating becomes another responsibility to squeeze in, like you're scheduling a job interview, Sarah Boyle, a 29-year-old public defender in Chicago, told me. Oh, let me pencil in this date for 3 weeks from now with this stranger from the internet. Modern romance requires a toll, in other words, paid in energy, in sanity, in cash, in hours, and not everyone can afford it. One 2025 study, which I feel obliged to report is called Making Enough for Love, found that the higher someone's income, the more likely they were to enter into a relationship, or simply to feel ready for one. You might protest that coupling is actually a savvy financial move. Indeed, it was once common for partners to marry first, then pool resources and work towards stability together. But sociologists today say that marriage is seen by many as a capstone, a trophy that people feel prepared for only after they've paid off debts, settled into a steady job, or saved enough to buy a house or have kids. Over the past 50 years, job security and stable hours have become scarcer, said Kristen Harknett, a UC Berkeley sociologist. That means traditional milestones are harder to reach,
and tying your livelihood to someone else's can feel like a liability rather than an advantage. On top of all this, COVID-19 triggered a pandemic dating recession, according to the Stanford sociologist Michael J. Rosenfeld. From 2017 to 2022, the number of single adults in the U.S. rose by about 5%, more than 13 million people, mostly because young people weren't meeting as frequently as before. Americans, mired in uncertainty, have lost faith that the old sources of stability, the economy, marriage, one another, will deliver them to solid ground. And mistrust and instability are bad for romance. I talked with plenty of researchers about numbers and theories, but I wanted to hear how this really feels, and not just for my Lonely Hearts Club.
So I created an informal survey to pass around to single people, asking how they approached dating, or didn't, how set they were on finding a partner, how that fit in with other life goals, and whether they were hopeful about finding love. I heard back from men, women, and non-binary people, queer and straight, ages 23 to 49, living in places such as Oklahoma City, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Bowling Green, Ohio, and Portland, Oregon. I talked with people from different race and class backgrounds, and what I heard was that a lot of them are tired. Dating is just a series of constant blows to whatever self-confidence I had, said Keith Cousin, a 42-year-old straight man from Queens. It's low-key soul-destroying. People are very commitment-resistant, and it's contagious, a queer 27-year-old from New Jersey said. Being alone and lonely and wanting is safer than risking being put through emotional distress. I think romancing myself, treating myself kindly, doing nice things alone like taking myself on a date and treating myself has yielded better results. I'm a part of the generation of Disney girls who were groomed from birth that our Prince Charming was coming, and unfortunately, I still believe that, wrote one 26-year-old woman in Los Angeles who'd been single her whole adult life, though she'd been diligently dating for years. Olivia Medina, another 26-year-old in Los Angeles, said that at the beginning of 2020, she'd been excited about a budding relationship with one of her college classmates. Then she had to spend her entire senior year online. By the time the world returned to relative normality, her priorities had shifted. I had basically created a whole new hierarchy of what's important, Medina said.
And dating was so low because I had gotten so used to just spending time with my friends and doing things that I like, for me. When the need for romance is low and the toll is steep, some give up. Others hold out for a partnership dreamy enough to justify the search. Again and again, people explained that their lives weren't lacking, and they would only carve out space in their days for someone who made them giddy. Having expectations this high is a magnificent historical novelty. The hard part is finding someone who can meet them. Joanna Davidson, a Boston University anthropologist, was living in a village in Guinea-Bissau when she began to notice a particular kind of run-down house. Kungomaku, she learned, were the structures women moved into after their husbands died and their homes were torn down, a custom among the Jola ethnic group, predominant in the region. The widows either borrowed rice paddies or begged for food. Yet fewer and fewer of them were willing to remarry, she determined, and the number of kungomaku kept growing. You sit and suffer under the punishment of your husband, one woman told her. When he dies, why would you go get punished by another man? When Davidson relayed all of this at an American Anthropological Association conference in Washington, D.C., the air felt charged with recognition. A room full of researchers could chart from their own fieldwork the depth of women's dissatisfaction. So Davidson and Dinah Hannaford, a University of Houston anthropologist, sent out a call for contributions for what would become their 2022 book, Opting Out: Women Messing with Marriage Around the World. Their inboxes flooded with case studies from countries rich and poor. In Botswana, they heard, many children are raised within networks of single women and their kin. Only about 4,500 Botswanans married in 2024, out of a population of 2.5 million. They learned about women in South Korea who had delayed marriage to take care of aging family members, then realized, looking around at the men in their lives, that they had no regrets. Hannaford wrote about women in Senegal marrying men who live abroad, or becoming a man's third or fourth wife, in the hopes of evading both the public disgrace of singlehood and the practical, emotional, and sexual labor of a typical union. 9 out of 10 people worldwide, the anthropologist pointed out, live in a country with falling marriage rates. The specific challenges varied by location, but all over the globe, women were fed up. Embedded throughout this volume, Davidson and Hannaford wrote in their introduction, is the seeming ubiquity of generally disappointing men. Call it a supply problem. Some researchers think that the great romance slump has been caused largely by a shortage of marriageable men. But to be fair to men, the old standards of success have become harder to achieve. In the United States, steady, well-paying blue-collar jobs have been all but decimated, and fewer men than women are earning the college degrees that have become almost a prerequisite for financial stability. The percentage of 25 to 54-year-old American men who are neither working nor seeking employment quadrupled over the past 70 years. A vanishing portion can single-handedly support a family or offer a partner any sense of security. More college-educated women have begun marrying men without a degree, picking off the high earners among them.
This means that women without a degree are, in turn, left with fewer prospects, and their marriage rates are plummeting, especially in areas where men face higher rates of joblessness and incarceration. Meanwhile, a lot of men are feeling painfully inadequate. It's not that money is the only thing a man can offer. After all, fewer women need a breadwinner now. But researchers told me that the qualities women now value more than ever, sensitivity, openness, communication skills, are not typically ingrained in men from childhood. And although men strive to meet those modern expectations, the old standards haven't disappeared. Men are supposed to pay for dinner, but also treat women as equals, to initiate flirty banter, but never be creepy or aggressive, to be sturdy and masculine, but also empathetic and thoughtful. Arthur, a 46-year-old in New Jersey who responded to my survey, said that he's dated women who think he's too nice. One explained that she broke up with him because he has dad energy. I'm not 100% sure what that means, Arthur told me, but I'm guessing it's not very sexy. Another said she liked how sweet and supportive he was, yet also wanted him to be more decisive, to be the man in the relationship, as Arthur saw it. He wasn't sure how to exhibit both traits at once. Other men I spoke with felt like the romantic odds were stacked against them, especially on dating apps. They had the sense that women were drowning in matches, while they were sending likes into the void. I feel like I'm being rejected by 4 million women at once, Cowson, the man from Queens, told me. The guys I talked with described men as demoralized schmucks, and women as thriving girl bosses, the rule setters, the winners, and the prize. The ones who want romance, but do not need it. But that idea makes women sound a lot more powerful and liberated than they really are, as a whole. Women may be going to college at higher rates, but they still make less, on average, than men with a comparable education in the same field of study. In the typical married or cohabiting straight couple, women still do much more of the domestic labor, even when the woman is the breadwinner. Chris Swiatoco, who ministers to single Christians, hears from many young women who are so exasperated by their search for romance that they are losing hope. They tell her versions of, "I'm meeting a lot of guys who still live at home at 27, and they're gamers, and that's all they're interested in doing." Allie Hoffman has noticed that many of the younger men at the Feels events seem relationally underdeveloped, particularly Gen Z men who have grown up in front of screens. They want connection, but when confronted with women's expectations, they can feel under-equipped and overwhelmed. The women I interviewed didn't seem picky so much as pessimistic and burned out on bad behavior. One had flown to visit a guy who was drunk for most of her stay, brushed off his neighbor calling her a piece of ass, and then soon after she returned home, texted her that they were never going to be together long term. Another woman had fallen for a coworker with whom she was getting dinner 2 to 4 times a week, and who turned out to be seriously dating someone else. A lot of stories were less dramatic, tales of confusion and quiet disappointment, featuring men who couldn't seem to express or even decide what they wanted. Most women, I think, know that good men are out there, but I don't blame them for growing cynical about the chances of finding one. The feminist progress of the past half-century has been met with a virulent backlash of misogyny. Nearly 60% of Gen Z men say that their country has gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men, according to a 2025 Ipsos poll of 30 countries, including the United States. Jessica Calarco, a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, said that many of her students' brothers watch videos of the manosphere influencer Andrew Tate, who has argued that women are the property of their husband, and who has been accused of rape, assault, and human trafficking, allegations he denies. If that's what they're seeing within their own family, why should they trust a stranger from an app? Hannah Tesler, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan, has studied the factors that influence whether singles value romantic partnership. In interviews, she found that most young male participants hadn't considered in much detail how they'd split household labor if they married or had kids with a partner. They weren't really expecting to make sacrifices. Young women, meanwhile, were weighing their choices accordingly. Some wanted a partnership only if it was truly equal. I don't want to sign up to be somebody else's, caregiver, mom, maid, sex robot, nanny, therapist, etc., Tesler summarized. Other women were willing to do just that if it meant they could have a family. Gigi Gale, a 44-year-old in Chicago, has been considering these sorts of trade-offs. She's not someone you'd expect to be looking for a more traditional arrangement. She's a college graduate who owns a marketing company in the nightclub industry and co-owns a counseling center. But she got tired of relationships in which she worked full-time and split the bills, and the men wanted her to cook, clean, and generally act like a counselor, as she put it, giving them advice, building them back up. So now she's decided to try leaning into being more submissive. She wants a provider, someone who'll make her feel cared for. First, she'll have to find him, and she's not having any luck. Gail's story reminded me of something else I'd heard. Carrie Rappaport-Zakin, a Manhattan therapist, said that many of her single female clients have been reading The Rules, a dating guide that was published in 1995 and was seen as retrograde even back then, because romance influencers are recommending it. Don't overwhelm him with your career triumphs, the book advises. Try to let him shine. Rappaport-Zakin finds it unnerving. All these smart, successful clients waiting for men to pursue them, trying to appear soft and undemanding, all in deference to a book so old that it warns women not to call a man's landline. But she understands why a blueprint like this is appealing. Plenty of her clients have tried going boldly after what they want, only to find that this turns men away. I kept encountering the same weary nostalgia for setups and meet-cutes, for steady jobs and gender norms. Some people I interviewed wished openly for more rules and fewer choices. When the present feels hostile to romance and the future is frightening or unknowable, can you blame people for looking to the past? In the months following the feels, I attended 5 other dating events across Brooklyn and Manhattan. I met countless jaded veterans of the New York singles circuit who regularly showed up to similar affairs or frequented the same one.
I chatted with a man who said he'd been to so many that he'd had to institute a rule for himself, 5 months between each, so as not to lose his mind. Later, when I recounted my observations to a friend, he said it reminded him of when he'd been looking for an apartment and kept seeing the same people on tours. One event, at a dimly lit Tribeca bar, was smushed next to a happy hour for real estate and land use experts. Attendees were given glowing colored wristbands. "Purple talk to purple, red talk to yellow," the MC called out. And then she spoon-fed us icebreaker questions, such as, "Who is your celebrity crush?" and "What's your dream date?" I went to 2 events, a straight one in the financial district and a better-dressed, queer one in Bushwick, where presenters used PowerPoint to pitch their single friends to the crowd. At yet another, in Williamsburg, people much braver than me pitched themselves to the room. One guitarist crooned a song she'd written about herself. Another did a stand-up routine about how she's American ugly, meaning only men from other countries find her attractive. The host joked that we were all too hot to need an event like this, so our personalities must be terrible. At the self-presentation event, I sat with a man who shared a sprawling list of deal breakers, pixie cuts and lack of physical fitness among them, and then proudly described himself as non-judgmental. During a speed dating night at a diner-like bar in Bushwick, I held court at my assigned booth while men rotated through the spot opposite me. I had only 3 minutes with each, but as I learned at the feels, 3 minutes can last a long time.
When I gently pushed back against one man's theory about the romance slump, the problem is that when women talk to one another about men, they start to hate them. He changed the subject. What's your favorite animal? It's hard to know when to get off the dating merry-go-round. Some people view the romance toll as an investment in their future self. On dating apps, you can always keep putting in the work, swiping and messaging and grabbing drinks and swiping again. The volume of potential matches is enormous, and so is the amount of time required to investigate each one, with no guarantees of success. The more you try, the more you want things to work out, and the less sure you become that they will. Others refuse to pay the toll. They delete the apps and hope love will find them. Margot Braca, a doctoral student in sociology at the University of Antwerp, said she no longer asks study participants if they are actively looking for a partner. The question that resonates more is whether they are open to a relationship. And many have simply made peace with not being in one, her colleague Elise Tahone told me. In this last category is Treasure Saunders, a 39-year-old who spent years in a string of serious relationships, during which she worked full-time, handled the housework, and took care of her 3 kids. She always seemed to lose her sense of self. When she decided she was done, she needed husband money, but without the husband. So she trained to become a technical engineer, working on transportation infrastructure, lots of concrete and steel. Then she used that salary to achieve a long-standing goal, purchasing a 4-unit property, most of which she rents out. At first, without a partner, she was lonely. But she started spending time at a nearby union hall for construction tradespeople and getting close to her fellow UA Local 130 members, almost all men. I have the big sweaters and the dirty jeans and the boots, and my hair is always a mess, she said. I kind of just settled right on in. And her girlfriends are so precious to her that she is, in a certain way, in love with them. They take one another out to sushi dinners, they travel together. I'm romantically involved with my friends, she said, adding with a hoot of laughter. And I use men for sex. In a perfect world, Saunders said, she wouldn't be single. But this is her reality. I heard similar sentiments in other interviews. Arthur, not beating the dad energy allegations, has decided to focus on being a good guy, a good employee, and a good uncle. Dating kept getting harder and harder, he said. After so much rejection, opening up to new people feels like asking to get hurt. So he said goodbye to the partner he'd once imagined. It was like I lost a parent, he told me. But it's like anything else, you know? You move on. He's been getting back in shape, learning new languages, and spending time with relatives in their 80s and 90s. He thinks, hopes, he's becoming a better person. Hoffman, the Feels founder, also once had a specific vision for her future. A soulmate, a brownstone, 2 kids. I had it all figured out, she said. And then it didn't happen. In her late 30s, she realized that her dream life was just a dream. She could only know what was right in front of her. As she said this over Zoom, she started naming things around her. An orange, a water bottle, to indicate how literally she meant this. Her goal now is total devotion to reality. The Feels asks participants to be in the moment together, paying attention to their bodies and their breathing. If romance follows, great. But she's often said that the events aren't just about partnership. They're about connection, embodiment, the chance to emote. Hoffman acknowledges that this philosophy is a tough sell for women who want kids, especially those in their late 30s to early 40s. At Feels events, that's the population that arrives with the most palpable anxiety. Because so many men date down in age, she said, women in that bracket are left with a portion of male prospects that is excruciatingly small. In my interviews too, baby longing was the great dividing line. The aspiring parents tended to feel most stressed. I will confess now that I am among the ones with no chill. After searching for nearly a decade, I met someone at a wedding almost 2 years ago who made romance feel unexpectedly easy. We're a 9-hour train ride apart, but I grew accustomed to the Amtrak Caprese sandwich. We said I love you 8 months in, which felt positively retro compared with my previous interminable communication-free situationships.
but he doesn't want kids, and I'm pretty sure I do. So here I am, in my 30s, in a long-distance open relationship with him, and somehow also back on the merry-go-round, running straight from work to meet strangers in bars across Brooklyn, prepared for another perfectly nice evening that will ultimately lead nowhere. Of course, people have kids without a partner all the time. In 2024, 40% of all babies in the US were born to unmarried women, 8 times the share in 1960. A growing number of men are deciding to become single dads.
Batya Novik, a therapist who works with people facing reproductive challenges, is seeing more single clients who want to discuss egg freezing or IVF. She hears so much about their romantic lives, or lack thereof, that she's become a de facto dating coach. Solo parenting, though, is rarely plan A. Raising a kid without a teammate is difficult, expensive, and sometimes lonely. So some people are looking for creative plan Bs. In 2011, Ivan Fitovic created a website called Modamily for people in search of a partner, not necessarily a romantic one, to have a child with. Fitovic was 35 when he realized that there might be demand for such a service. His female friends were starting to worry about their biological clocks, and their dating lives weren't going anywhere. Maybe the person that you have children with, he said, is not the person that you grow old with. Modamily now has more than 120,000 users, and it's led to more than 1,000 babies being born, according to Fitovic. Through Fitovic, I got in touch with Zachary Sahuke and Amanda Lowe's, who have 2 children together from IVF, and are considering using their frozen embryos for a third. When they met on Modamily in 2019, they were both single and antsy to have kids. Lowe's was 40 and preparing to have a child on her own, but figured she'd give the site a shot. After vetting each other for a few months, talking about God and ethics and parenting styles, they decided they could work well as co-parents. They'd both been through some painful romantic experiences and thought this way might be cleaner, avoiding the great rush of feelings and the disappointment when they fade.
Sahuk hoped for what many of us consider a second best case scenario. We'll be like a happily divorced couple. In that sense, their dream came true. They've become close friends. With their 2 boys, they go on vacations, spend holidays together, and have the occasional family dinner. Sahuk is grateful for how dedicated Los is to the kids. Los is happy to have a co-parent at all, but especially someone so warm, who has never made their situation feel awkward. Listening to them, I started imagining that I too might find someone on Modamily. But then I realized with a sinking feeling that as unconventional as Sahuk and Los's setup is, they still follow traditional gender roles. They reside on his 55-acre ranch in Price, Texas, but she and the kids live in a mobile home on the property. He travels constantly for work, and she balances childcare and a full-time teaching job. He's dated since they had kids, but she rarely has the time. And although the women Sahuk has dated seem charmed by their unusual parenting arrangement, she told me the men she's met seem threatened by it. There's just something that draws women to men who are actively involved in their kids' lives, she said. But a woman with 2 little kids is more of a burden than a benefit. I felt like I'd burst through a new door only to find myself in the same room. We're living in a strange in-between time. Women have gained enough agency to work outside the home, but many still lack equality within it. Men could benefit from a new set of gender norms, but much of American culture embraces the old ones. People can do without romance, but what are they replacing it with?
The anthropologist Diana Hannaford's concern, after seeing women around the globe opt out in different ways, is that single Americans are encouraged to find meaning in professional gain, wellness, and self-actualization, individual pursuits rather than collective ones. In the past decade or so, happiness rates have declined precipitously for unmarried adults, regardless of education level, much more so for those who are married, Yifeng Wan, a researcher at the University of Virginia, has found. In that sense, singlehood is getting harder, even as it's less stigmatized. Perhaps that's because faith groups, civic organizations, and other communities play a less central role in American life than they once did. These networks used to buffer against isolation and economic displacement, the thorns of modern life that make partnership more valuable, yet love more difficult to find. One of the things that makes us human, the anthropologist Joanna Davidson told me,
is that we can envision alternative futures. But first, we must look frankly at the present. The women she and Hannaford featured in Opting Out weren't part of an orchestrated revolution against marriage. Most of them still valued romance. They didn't experience singlehood as unequivocally liberating, the authors wrote. They simply made choices within their given constraints. This was Allie Hoffman's credo, in a way, total devotion to reality. Yet when enough people veer from tradition, if only to inch their own life forward, a social movement begins. I'm not sure where this one is leading us, but I feel hopeful when I think back to my first interview with Chris Swiato, the singles minister.
Jesus was single, she likes to remind congregants. In her 20s, she said, she'd hopped from boyfriend to boyfriend. She was in debt, drinking, and partying to try to fill the well, the empty place within her. Her parents' church didn't have any single members around her age. But then she learned about a group called Singles Offering Life to Others, or SOLO, and that's where she found her sense of purpose. Now she tours the country, teaching church leaders, who are mostly married fathers, how to engage the growing number of single people they need to fill their pews. I do this, she said, because I see me everywhere out there. I found it curious, though, that despite living such a rich, full life as a single person, she urges congregants not to give up on romance. So I asked about the discrepancy. Sviatoko still believes in the beauty of partnership, she said, but she doesn't think that she'll find it anytime soon, and she's content with what's in front of her. She talks with single friends sometimes, half joking, half serious, about buying tiny homes, parking them somewhere, and making a DIY retirement village. Each night they would gather around a fire pit, cook dinner, and talk about their day. It's a tribute to reality, and also an exercise in imagination. It sounds pretty romantic to me. This article originally stated that birth control was legalized for married couples in 1965. In fact, in 1965, the Supreme Court held that the government couldn't restrict a married couple's access to birth control. The article appears in the September 2026 print edition with the headline, "The Great Romance Slump." When you buy a book using a link on this page, we receive a commission. Thank you for supporting The Atlantic.
Faith Hill leaves the listener staring at a phone with hundreds of unread messages, exhausted by a dating market that offers endless options but very little actual connection. Young people opting out of romance entirely looks like a brand new problem, driven by apps and awkward singles events. But turn to Rosa Campbell, and that modern exhaustion starts to look like the echo of an older disappointment. Campbell looks back at the researcher Shere Hite handing out surveys in 1970s Manhattan. Back then, the old rules around intimacy were vanishing. Women had the birth control pill and no-fault divorce. But as Campbell points out, removing those barriers just meant women were expected to have more sex on male terms, leaving them frustrated. Notice how the two writers pinpoint the exact same trap, 50 years apart. Tearing down traditional rules, whether it's the stigma around premarital sex in the 70s or the pressure to marry today, doesn't automatically build better relationships. Read alongside Campbell, Hill's modern dating slump looks less like a tech problem and more like an unfinished revolution. If the basic power dynamic between men and women goes untouched, endless freedom just becomes another exhausting chore.
In 1972, Shere Hite, a Playboy model turned feminist sex researcher, jumped on a motorbike and drove around Manhattan. With a cascade of strawberry blonde curls peeping out under the helmet, rosebud lips visible under the visor, and a vintage lace gown streaming behind her, she handed out surveys to any woman who would take one. It was all about sex. Across 58 questions, Hite asked, "Could you describe what an orgasm feels like to you? Do you feel free to do all the things you would like in sex, or do you think the other persons would be shocked? Do you think sex is in any way political?" The responses formed the basis of the feminist sexology bestseller, The Hite Report, a nationwide study of female sexuality, 1976. It sold 50 million copies. This was among the first books that asked women how they felt about sex, rather than telling them what to feel. Its great provocation was that most American women were sexually dissatisfied.
70% of them could not orgasm from penetrative sex, but required clitoral stimulation. A significant proportion of women faked orgasms. The Hite report remains the 30th best-selling book of all time, and one of the most read books of the 20th century. Yet today, it and its author have largely vanished.
By the early 1970s, the number of young women in the US who reported having had premarital sex was around 62%, up from 7.6% of those born before 1900. The pill was widely available. 10 million women were using it, decoupling sex from reproduction for the first time in history. And the introduction of no-fault divorce in California in 1969, soon followed by other states, meant that women could more easily free themselves from loveless marriages. Into this confounding sexual revolution, Shere published her Hite report. Hite found that the sexual revolution meant more sex for women, but not better sex. For many of the women she surveyed, sex still followed a similar and unsatisfactory pattern that one woman described as a little kiss, a little feel, a finger for arousal, a touch of breast, and he's on top. Wham, it's over. Invariably, male orgasm determined the end of sex. One woman, freed up by the sexual revolution to have many lovers, noted that, "I'm beginning to think there must be something like a sexual Robert's Rules of Order, which every guy follows." Even Alex Comfort's widely read book, The Joy of Sex, 1972, couldn't get away from the sexual script that saw penis in vagina sex as the pièce de résistance. A black lesbian who filled out the original survey on which the Hite report was based remarked that she didn't think much of Comfort's contribution. Women also felt that during the sexual revolution they had lost their right to say no. One woman told Hite, "Most men didn't give a damn about whether I wanted to have sex with them or not. If I didn't want to screw them, they would try to lecture me into being free." Sexual inequality percolated through the revolution. Hite's path to feminism was unusual. While enrolled on a PhD at Columbia University in New York, she worked as a model, sometimes doing fashion jobs, sometimes porn, which paid better, and was hired by Olivetti typewriters to appear in an advertisement. But as Hite later recalled, when the advertisement was published, she found her image appeared beneath a sexist caption. "The typewriter is so smart that she doesn't have to be." That prompted the New York chapter of the National Organization for Women, NOW, to launch a protest. They marched through Manhattan with placards that proclaimed, "Don't drown in the Olivetti typing pool." Hite was overjoyed by the support. She contacted NOW and soon became involved in political campaigns and consciousness-raising groups, CRs, the key tactic of women's liberation. At CR, women met in small groups to talk about how a sexist society shaped them, often against their own interests. They would take turns answering questions like, "How do you feel about housework?" and "How do you feel about aging?" Women came to understand that their feelings, often bad, were political, the result of a deeply unequal world, not their individual failings. They often described this moment of consciousness-raising as a click. There was a political cause to their personal misery. Feelings were a form of expertise. Women could follow them to paint a collective picture of what life was like as women, what needed to change, and how they might go about it. But Hite noticed something else at CR. Women talked of their feelings about every aspect of culture and society, except for sex. Even in these groups, sex was still considered a private matter, personal, even shameful. A porn mag ran Hite's questionnaire in the interest of better communication with women. There had been some feminist writing about sex. In The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm, 1970, Anne Coet argued forcefully that all orgasms were clitoral. Erica Jong, in her novel Fear of Flying, celebrated the pleasures of the zipless fuck, a sexual encounter without commitment or emotion. Nancy Friday's My Secret Garden detailed women's most explicit fantasies. Both Friday's and Jong's works were blockbusters, and many women who filled out Hite's original survey reported reading them. But how did these declarations, fictitious accounts and wild wishes match up to the truth of women's sex lives? To find out, Hite proposed a weekend-long CR conference to discuss sex frankly. Her comrades, however, were flabbergasted, even horrified. One woman protested, "You think I'm going to stand up and tell everyone about how I have orgasms?" To overcome women's shyness and shame about sex, Hite developed her anonymous questionnaire. Hite's questionnaire travelled well beyond the women's movement. First, she handed it out in New York, and soon she was sending 100,000 copies through abortion rights groups and church newsletters. Brides and Mademoiselle magazines reproduced the questionnaire, and we, a porn mag, ran it in the interest of better communication with women, alongside a centrefold of Better Girls Than Last Month. Men passed it to their wives and girlfriends, and women who came across the questionnaire showed it wide-eyed to their female friends. Mothers passed it to sisters, and teachers to students. Responses to the questionnaire uncovered something surprising. The major influence on many women's sex lives was not feminism or the sexual revolution, but psychoanalysis. In Sigmund Freud's 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, 1905, he grafted ideas of mature, immature, and healthy, dysfunctional forms of female sexuality onto the vagina and clitoris, respectively. According to Freud, girls find pleasure in their clitoris, just as young boys do in their penis. But as girls mature into women, the pleasure centre moves from the clitoris to the vagina, as women put aside their childish masculinity. In the mature, heterosexual woman, Freud located the erotic and the reproductive in the same place, the vagina. As Freud saw it, the clitoris would naturally transmit excitation to the adjacent sexual parts, the way a pine shaving would help set a log of harder wood on fire. The log he was referring to was the vagina, but this simile choice was a monstrous Freudian slip, exposing who the vaginal orgasm was for, whose pleasure it would increase, and the limits of Freud's own gender politics. If grown women could not orgasm vaginally because the vaginal orifice remained anaesthetised, this was because of their sexual immaturity. Freud recommended this should be treated with psychoanalysis. In other words, not being able to orgasm vaginally was seen as a mental illness. By the 1970s, the problem was with conservative neo-Freudians. Many women who could not orgasm vaginally had been sent to Freudian psychotherapy, which wholly embraced anti-feminism from the 1940s on. As the historian Jane Gerhardt has shown in Desiring Revolution, 2001, psychoanalysts held that heterosexual reproductive sex was the only model of mature femininity. In therapy, women were told that their lack of vaginal orgasm was a result of neurotic blocks and deficiencies in the psyche, and they believed it. One woman told Hite, "I can have an orgasm with clitoral stimulation, but I have never had one with intercourse. This is purely a fear thing. My therapist helped me see it." Another spoke of how she came to see clitoral orgasm as selfish or infantile, thanks to Freud, I guess. Conservative neo-Freudians insisted to women that their inability to orgasm vaginally was a physical symptom of their psychic refusal to adjust to their role as women. This was the price they paid for rejecting their passive maternal place in the bedroom and the family. The idea extended far beyond the therapist's office. Even if women were not in therapy, Hite, like Betty Friedan before her, suggested that the influence of these psychiatric theories on women has been strong and pervasive. These unfounded and anti-woman theories are endlessly repeated in women's magazines, in movies, in marriage manuals. In the survey, women used therapeutic language again and again to scold themselves. "I must let go, relax and trust, unlearn my taboos and defences." This is why major feminist thinkers like Hite, Friedan, Shulamith Firestone and Kate Millett wrote against psychoanalysis. As they saw it, therapy helped women to accept the unacceptable and adjust to the conditions around them, rather than changing those conditions. "I wish we could have back all the time and energy we have spent blaming ourselves," Hite wrote, "and all the money we have spent flocking to the psychiatrists. I would like to have what we would have built with that energy. By looking at sex through the lens of feminism, Hite found that it was shot through with power and inequality. In her questionnaire, she also asked about recent sexology. Have you read Masters and Johnson's recent scientific studies on human sexual response? What did you think of them? Of Kinsey? Any other writers? She wondered if this newer work would help women flip the sexual script. Working across the 1940s and 50s, the biologist Alfred Kinsey was interested in how people really did it beyond what social norms prescribed. Through in-depth interviews with 18,000 people, he sought to learn how people had sex, with whom and how often. He fearlessly asked, did people have sex outside marriage, with people of the same sex, in public? With animals? He published his Kinsey reports in 1948 on men and 1953 on women, after which the Hite report was named. As Hite explained on the Mike Douglas show in 1982, Kinsey did a service in putting on the map how often people did what with whom. But my area was a little different. I asked people, why do you do it? How do you feel about it? And would you like to be different? Would you like things to be different? So I'm really trying to draw a larger picture of the society and how people are feeling within that society. The gynecologist William Masters and the sexologist Virginia Johnson were interested in people's physical responses to sex. They conducted direct laboratory observation of nearly 10,000 sex acts from the late 1950s to 1965. They invited volunteers, initially sex workers, and hooked them up to wires, which enabled them to measure heart rate during sex and contractions during orgasm. They observed women having sex with a glass dildo, improbably called Ulysses. A light and camera within Ulysses allowed them to see inside the vagina during sex and observe the moment of orgasm. This led to the conclusion, important for the Hite report, that all women's orgasms were clitoral orgasms, and that women who were orgasming from intercourse were doing so because the clitoris was indirectly stimulated by the penis. Masters and Johnson's findings gave them the opportunity to depose penetration as the highest form of sex and elevate masturbation, clitoral stimulation, and lesbian sex as possibilities. Alas, they did not. Instead, they merely suggested that most women could orgasm from the indirect stimulation of the clitoris during penetration, that this was automatic, part of the normal course of sex. Hite concluded that Masters and Johnson never suggested direct clitoral stimulation for women because they continued to view sex through certain cultural blinders. She was being diplomatic here. These two researchers were deeply committed to monogamous, heterosexual marriage as the highest form of relationship. From 1968, they ran a treatment program for dissatisfied homosexual men, helping them to convert to heterosexuality, which continued long after homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as a psychological disorder in 1973. Masters and Johnson's ideas about women also reflected the pair's sexual values. If orgasm for women was par for the course, this meant that there was no need for men to have sex differently. They could maintain the predictable sex that served them so well, and many women not at all. For Hite, it wasn't because of lack of knowledge that women didn't speak up about what they wanted in sex. It was lack of power. Her great innovation lay in bringing feminism to sex. By looking at sex through the lens of feminism, Hite found that it was shot through with power and inequality. Society insisted that women, like men, should find their greatest pleasure in penetrative sex. The woman penetrated, the man penetrating. In an interview in 1977, Hite declared that sex is sexist. Women's sex lives clearly reflect their second-class position in the society. Women, still in 1976, make only 60% of the amount of money men make for the same work. Men have the right to more rewards, money, services, respect, than women. Just so in sex. Like many white women involved in the women's liberation movement, Hite understood gender as the primary oppression in women's lives, from which all other oppression, such as class and race, flowed.
Black feminists argued that when the women's movement referred to women, it meant white women. But this whiteness was almost never mentioned. It was made invisible in the universal idea of woman. Race went unanalyzed in Hite's study. But black women did read and respond. They filled out her questionnaire and wrote letters after they read the book, and often they pushed her project further.
One black woman who recorded her responses on tape remarked, "When I was growing up, black women had no beauty." A young black law student wrote that she couldn't screw across barriers, that white men didn't desire her. A Chinese-American woman noted that her racial identity made a difference to her sex life. She noted sardonically that Chinese is in this year. These responses demonstrated how race and racism are, like gender injustice, woven into sexual encounters, and offer insight into how women of colour negotiated this discrimination. What has become of the sexual revolution, and what does Hite's work still have to offer? Today, women's pleasure is taken more seriously, thanks in part to feminists like Hite. The majority of women whom Hite surveyed regularly masturbated to orgasm, but felt lonely, guilty, unwanted, selfish, silly, and generally bad as a result. That shame is not nearly as widespread as it used to be. One study of American women in 2014 found that a majority felt sexually empowered after masturbating. In the UK, the Labour MP Samantha Niblett launched Yes, Sex Please, We're British, a play on the title of a comedy film from 1973. She plans to host a sex toy exhibition in the Palace of Westminster as part of her campaign to promote sex education and destigmatise women's pleasure. Laws around rape and consent have changed too, owing to feminist pressure. As legal scholars and historians such as Alicia Simmons, Isabella Scott and Joanna Bork write, rape is no longer a crime of force as it was in previous centuries, defined as damage to a man's property, that is, his wife or virgin daughter. Rape has been redefined in terms of sexual consent. Courts in rape trials now ascertain how consent was given or not. What did the victim say? What did the perpetrator ask? And consent has permeated sexual politics far beyond the courts. It's not just the litmus test for whether sex was rape, but the mode by which pleasurable sex can be achieved. We are, as the scholar Catherine Angel writes in Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, 2021, living in an age where the ideal of consent reigns supreme. Since the 2000s, women have been urged to find out what they want and go for it assertively. The rise of consent politics dovetailed with the age of girl boss feminism, which urged women to lean in both their personal and professional lives. Hite helped usher in this change. In her book, she urged women, you have to care about yourself and want to please yourself, and you have to feel it is your right. You have to do it, whatever it is, or ask for it, very clearly and very specifically. Hite was highly combative, quick to quit interviews if she sensed misogyny, which was often. And yet, for Hite, knowing yourself and speaking up was only the beginning. It was not a bad start, but she knew that structural inequality couldn't really be solved by a straight couple in bed, no matter how honest their communication. She knew that inequality pervades our choices and feelings long before we've set foot in the bedroom, before we've uttered a yes or a no. The focus today on consent has not challenged gender inequality beyond the bedroom. The gender pay gap, attacks on abortion rights, endemic sexual violence, and the orgasm gap, which names the disparity between men and women's orgasms in straight sex, roll on relentlessly, shaping our desires long before the sexual encounter. Nor has our age of consent held back the tide of the alt-right. Manosphere influencers preach that women's sexual assertiveness is evidence that feminism has gone too far and that the world is now stacked against men. Tradwives, too, argue that women having multiple sexual partners, which they refer to as a body count, before marriage, makes them unhappy, resorting to tired old claims that women are not built for casual sex, only monogamy, childbearing, and wifely submission. Hite published 2 more books, The Hite Report on Male Sexuality, 1981, and Women and Love, 1987. The responses to these were very different from her first. The latter books were methodologically flawed, and the statistics she uncovered were startling to the point of being unconvincing. 84% of women are not satisfied emotionally with their relationships, she claimed, and 70% of women and men in long-term marriages had affairs. These statistics were not corroborated. Other research reported an infidelity rate of 15 to 20% for women. Furthermore, Hite was highly combative, quick to quit interviews if she sensed misogyny, which was often. She herself became the story, not the inarguable data of a robust survey. When in 1987 an interviewer for the TV show 60 Minutes Australia opened with, "You've been accused of man-bashing," Hite interrupted him to say, "Yeah, and it's going to happen right here," before storming out. The media had their narrative, and it wasn't her serious work. During the anti-feminist backlash of the late 80s and 90s, Hite disappeared in a storm of media attacks, wrought by a rising new right. Many conservatives felt that the upheavals of the 1960s, feminism and civil rights, had shattered their worlds. The new right, which included evangelical leaders such as Tim LaHaye and Jerry Falwell, and right-wing women such as Phyllis Schlafly, Anita Bryant and Beverly LaHaye, gave vent to this gathering discontent. They argued that feminism was unnatural and that biological differences between men and women excused inequality. They braided this with a politics of grievance, suggesting that the progressive politics of the 1960s and 70s had captured the interests of government and left ordinary Americans behind. Soon the media closed ranks. From the London Review of Books and the Washington Post to the New York Post and Penthouse, all went after her. Time magazine wrote that Women and Love was the author's own male-bashing diatribe, and that the entire book was full of extreme views of malcontented women. New York magazine claimed that she totally neglects biology, and that men were naturally promiscuous. If the success of the first Hite report narrates the rise of feminism, then the later trashing of Hite tells the story of its conservative backlash. Hite fled the US in the mid-1990s and spent her last years living peripatetically across Europe. She died in Tottenham, North London, in 2020. In the first Hite report, she quoted several women on how the women's movement changed their sex lives. One wrote, "With the onset of the women's movement and its personal effect on me, I've stopped faking them." Another, "I don't think I ever asked for what I wanted. Now the women's movement has helped me to be outspoken. I ask for what I want in all sorts of situations: church, work, the supermarket, local government, and in bed. It was women's liberation that would make a new kind of physical relations to go with a new, more humane and pro-women society. In the long term, a gender-just world would remake the conditions that shaped desires and change the way that sexual choices are moulded." But Hite believed that feminist struggle would change women in the present too. As women came to see themselves and others not as objects but as subjects, they would begin at last to be free. Throughout her life, Hite was uncompromising. To change sex for the better, women must be feminists.
A deleted dating app and a discarded 1970s marriage manual share the same promise of freedom. But clearing out traditional expectations doesn't automatically build a better connection. As both eras show, the old power imbalances between men and women just slip into new clothes. What lingers is the sense that stripping away the restrictions on intimacy is only the easy part. The question left to sit with is much harder. If rewriting the rules of romance isn't enough to fix the imbalance, what does an equal partnership actually look like?